Now up to Chapter 8, Part 2 of the lecture video series. In this chapter we're going to start out, in this section of the chapter we're going to start out by talking about aggregate supply. In the first part we discussed aggregate demand and now it's downward sloping, why we think that's the case. We're going to do the same thing with aggregate supply. What we're talking about right now is short-run aggregate supply, and we've got to make that distinction here soon, but I'll leave that for later in the video. So the question we're trying to address here is, why is short-run aggregate supply upward sloping? And what we mean by short-run versus long-run, I want to wait on, okay? I want to wait on discussing that. But just to be brief, short-run aggregate supply thinks about what happens immediately. When CPI changes, what happens immediately? And what we think happens is that when CPI goes up, for example, we believe that when CPI goes up, that the production also rises immediately in the short run, we would say, okay? So short run aggregate supply, again, refers to what happens immediately after prices rise in regards to the production of all goods and services. And again, what we're talking about here is CPI and real GDP. So if I'm trying to answer this question, I need to make sure that I discuss both CPI and real GDP in my answer. So we're going to go over a couple of theories here. And the first one that we'll discuss is the sticky wage theory. Remember, when we're talking about total production, production going up or going down can be a challenge, especially production going up. Because when it comes to all goods and services, producing more means figuring out a way to use more resources, which is not always possible. So this is more challenging than, say, the price of tacos going up, like we talked about in the last video. Price of tacos goes up, produce more tacos, cut back on producing quesadillas. But if we're producing more of everything, we're not cutting back on anything, right? We're producing more of everything. So that's a bit of a challenge. So here's one reason why we think this is probably upward sloping, the sticky wage theory. Here's the logic. When CPI increases, or decreases for that matter, wages don't typically adjust right away. Due to contracts, minimum wage laws, etc. In other words, wages are sticky. That's where the sticky wage theory concept comes from. So my salary is a good example. Here at Georgia College, we're on year-long contracts. So when I signed my contract in July, I just signed mine yesterday. When I signed my contract in July, I know what my salary is going to be for the entirety of next year, all the way up until next July. So my salary is sticky over a one-year period. So what that means is, if CPI changes, my real wealth is going to change along with it, because my salary certainly is not going to adjust, okay? So if CPI goes up, my salary remains at the exact same level. That means my wealth is actually declining, right? So let's say I make $100,000 a year. If CPI goes up, my $100,000 is now worth less, so I become poor, okay? That's basically the idea behind it. But again, we're thinking about production, okay? So I'm not thinking about my wealth per se. Let's think more about how producers would use that information, would respond to the fact that labor prices change, okay? So here's what I mean. When CPI increases, wages don't typically adjust right away. Wages don't typically adjust right away due to contracts, minimum wage laws, and things like that. Thus, when CPI increases, and nominal wages don't change, real wages are now lower. Okay? It's a lot to take in, but the logic is pretty sound, I think. When CPI goes up, the prices of goods and services are rising, but salaries don't change. So now those workers are paid the same nominally, but they're paid less in real terms. Just like the example I was just giving. If I'm getting paid $100,000 a year and prices go up, my salary is locked in at $100,000. Now the reason this would matter to a business is imagine, let's move away from the education side of things. Things are always weird with governments. Let's think more about a private company. Let's get back to thinking about tacos. Why not? That's a good example. If the price of tacos alone goes up, that means businesses can sell their tacos at a higher price. But their employees are still getting paid the same amount. This is a really good situation for the business. They can sell their product at a higher price, but their labor, their cost in regards to labor, is not adjusting to that increasing price of tacos. So if I'm a business, this is a great situation for me. And what do I want to do? What do businesses want to do if their labor is getting cheaper? They want to hire more of it, okay? So businesses hire more labor. So maybe at Taco Bell, they're paying their employees $10 an hour. And they tell their employees, look, we were paying you $10 an hour. You were working 30 hours a week. We want to start hiring you for 40 hours a week, okay? So they can produce more tacos. That's how they're going to produce more tacos, is by getting the workers to work more. And this is a good time for the businesses to do that because the labor now is relatively cheap in real terms, okay? So businesses hire more labor. That allows more production. So real GDP produced increases. So that's one reason why we think this might have this general shape over here, okay? Let's run back through it one more time to make sure we understand it. When CPI goes up, businesses can sell their products for a higher price. But because wages are usually based on things like contracts or determined by things like minimum wage, the wages don't change right away. So prices are up, but wages are locked in, all right? Since prices are up and wages are locked in, the workers are now, in real terms, paid less. Businesses hire more labor because the labor now is cheaper in real terms. And since they're hiring more labor, they're able to produce more, which makes a heck of a lot of sense because they want to take advantage of the higher prices of the good they're selling, okay? So what we end up having is this general relationship. When CPI increases, real GDP produced increases as well. And that's the sticky wage theory. Okay? Let's go through one more theory. In the book, I think they do three. I'm just going to cover two today. I'm teaching this right now in summer 2018, so if you're seeing this in 2020 or something, maybe you're sick and you missed class during a regular in-class semester, make sure you talk to me and make sure we only cover two in class because I don't want you to miss something. So the second one I'm going to cover today for my summer 2018 class is the misperceptions theory. The misperceptions theory. So here's the logic. As the CPI goes up, businesses may think that their goods prices are rising only. This was quite confusing. This is definitely one of the more complex concepts we cover. The logic here is if CPI goes up, and let's focus on, let's get back to tacos, okay? So I'm producing tacos, and let's say that I've been producing tacos and I've been able to sell them for $1. But now people are buying them like crazy, and I now can sell them for $2. I can sell all the tacos I have for $2, okay? Your gut reaction there is if you can produce more tacos, or if you can sell tacos at a higher price, you want to produce more, okay? The gut reaction here is to think about this from basic supply and demand, right? Price of tacos, quantity of tacos. And when that price goes up from $1 to $2, I'm going to respond by producing more tacos, okay? What makes this a misperceptions, though, is I could ramp up my production of tacos, but then a week down the road, when I need to get more supplies, when I need to go out and buy more meat, and I need to buy more tortillas, and I need to buy more electricity, when I go out to buy more intermediate goods, I realize that the price of everything went up. So I might be making a mistake here. When I sold more tacos, maybe I shouldn't have sold more tacos. Maybe I should have just raised the price a little bit further and done nothing else. Okay? In other words, let me pose it this way. What if the price of everything, including salaries, doubled all of a sudden? Well, if the price of everything doubled all of a sudden, you know what would happen? Nothing else. If the price of literally everything doubled simultaneously, I don't think a whole lot would happen. Prices would double, salaries would double, everything would double, and the economy would operate pretty similar to the way it is now. However, imagine if you didn't know the price of everything doubled. What if you only thought it was the price of tacos that went up? Well, then you might get really excited and sell a whole bunch of tacos, try to sell a whole bunch. But then, when you realize the price of everything went up, you might realize, well, this was a bad decision, okay? I shouldn't have sold more tacos. I should have just raised the price a little bit further, okay? So here's the logic of the misperceptions theory. What's being misperceived is that when prices go up, businesses may think it's only their own prices, produce more, and then down the road, when they realize they've made a mistake, they adjust back to producing what they were initially. This is a complicated idea, and I certainly encourage you to read the book and look for other explanations online, because this is one of the harder things, frankly, for me to teach. I think it's sometimes hard to explain exactly what's going on here. Hopefully that helped. Hopefully that was at least a decent explanation. Okay, so let's go back through it one more time and then finish this off. CPI goes up. Businesses think it's only their own prices going up, so they increase production. All right? Since they're increasing production, the real GDP produced increases too. And this is going to be temporary. This is what makes it a short-run thing, because eventually they're going to realize the mistake they've made. They're going to realize the prices of everything went up, and they're going to adjust accordingly. But right away, in the short run, immediately after prices go up, they increase production. So what we have here is this positive relationship that as CPI goes up, real GDP produced goes up too. That's why short and aggregate supply may be upward sloping. So that's the logic for short-run aggregate supply. So we've got short and aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We've got just one more thing to tackle, and this is long-run aggregate supply. And before we discuss that, we need to get a feel for what it means, the division between short-run and long-run. This is kind of a side note that I don't think the book does a very good job of expressing or even really trying to discuss, but it's important. The general difference between short and long runs. Okay? So let me give you a couple of examples here. And these are going to be kind of silly, but let's just think about them. Example one, let's say I stub my toe. I'm in here teaching, and I run into a chair and I stub my toe. How is that going to affect my life? All right, how is it going to affect my life if I stub my toe? Well, it depends. All right, 5 minutes from now, it'll affect my life in a certain way. I'll be complaining about my toe hurting. I might not be able to go for a run tonight, right? I'll be sitting here grimacing. Maybe it affects my happiness today. Maybe it affects my happiness tomorrow. But if I think about where my life is going to be a year from now, the stub toe is going to do nothing, right? It's going to have no effect. So the thing that we're trying to get at is understanding that some things have a short run and a long run effect that is very different. In the case of a stubbed toe, there are short run effects. You know, pain, anger, exercise less, you know, things like that. Maybe I have trouble sleeping. So there will be short run effects. But the long run effects are nil. There are no long run effects, right? Meaning, if you look a year down the road or 10 years down the road, it's not going to matter anymore. It's not going to matter that stubbed toe. It's not going to do anything. It's kind of like, you know, what grade did you get on the first exam? Okay, for most of you, if you did really well or really poorly on the first exam, there's short run effects. Long run effects probably aren't that big, right? So let's say you did really bad. The short run effects are you're upset, maybe you're mad, maybe you're sad, maybe you're frustrated, maybe it causes you to retake the exam. Maybe it affects you for a few years. But chances are, if we look at your life 20 years down the road, that exam is no longer important at that point. Okay? So there's a short run and a long run effect. So basically here is what's challenging about the short run or the long run. The length of the short run depends on the issue. Okay? So the short run is the immediate period after an event. Where the event is still creating initial effects, whatever those may be. This is kind of a hard one to describe because it's so different for different concepts. So it's different for still creating its initial effects. So I stub my toe, I'm hurting, I'm having trouble getting sleep. That's the short run. The long run's a period where that ends. Okay, so the long run. And this is a horrible definition, but it's very hard to describe. It's the period after the short run. Where the situation reaches kind of like an equilibrium or a conclusion. Okay? Some events have short run and long run effects. Some only have a short run effect. So if I stub my toe, there are short run effects where I'm upset and it hurts. The long run effect is there's not one, right? It goes away. But let's say instead that instead of stubbing my toe, let's say that my right leg just gets ripped off in a terrible automobile accident. Yeah, I hope that doesn't happen. So let's imagine my right leg gets completely ripped off. The short run effects will be agonizing pain, many trips to the doctor, right? Tons and tons of short run effects. And if you look at my life 20 years down the road, it's still going to be impacting me, but it's kind of like I've reached an equilibrium, right? In other words, like immediately after I lose my leg, the days are going to be all affected by the fact that my leg was ripped off, right? Every day is going to have pain, going to the doctor for so many years. But then 20 years down the road, or 21, or 22, or 23 years down the road, those years are all going to look pretty similar. So the fact that I've lost my leg is going to have short run effects and long run effects. And the long run represents after I've gotten past those days where I'm really experiencing the initial effects of the injury. Okay? Very strange way to think about things, but this is the way we view short run versus long run in economics. The short run is the initial period, the long run is after the dust settles. And these effects, the short run can be really long or really short depending on what the specific event is, what the concept is that we're actually talking about. So let me show you how this fits into Chapter 8. Let's focus on production. All right, aggregate supply, such as we've been discussing. And the question is, what happens if CPI suddenly increases? let's say 10%. Okay? What happens if the CPI suddenly increases 10%? Well, the short run effects which there are probably many, but I'm just going to focus on a couple, or really the main one, is that real GDP produced will increase. Okay? And why will it increase? Well, because of the sticky wage theory. The sticky wage effect. When CPI goes up, the businesses know that they can sell their product for a higher price, but the labor is still the same price, okay? So prices are going up, but labor has the same wage. Labor is now cheap. Hire more labor, produce more. That's the sticky wage effect. The other reason is the misperceptions effect. The logic here is when CPI goes up 10%, sometimes businesses think it's only their own prices, so they ramp up production and produce more, okay? But what's going to make these short-run effects only? The reason this isn't going to persist into the long run is both of these are going to end. Why will the sticky wage effect end? That will end because wages will eventually adjust. I talked about my own salary, right? If I'm paid $100,000 a year and CPI goes up, my wage is not going to adjust. But eventually it will, right? Meaning if CPI goes up and I look at my salary 3 years from now, it will have calibrated to account for the CPI changes over the past year. Okay? So that will go away. Misperceptions effect, that will also go away because eventually the businesses will realize that the price of everything has gone up 10% and they'll raise their prices and they'll lower back down to regular production. Okay? So these will go away. So the long run effects are actually, well, there aren't any in terms of production. The real GDP produced does not change in the long run. So for example, if the long run production is $20 trillion, if CPI goes up, okay, and remember we're talking, when we say real GDP, that 20 trillion accounts for inflation, so real production, okay? So if CPI goes up and the current real GDP is 20 trillion, when CPI goes up, it's going to cause some short-run effects. Short-run production is going to go up, okay? But if we look 5 years down the road, real GDP is not going to be affected by that price increase, okay? So if the real GDP right now is 20 trillion and ceteris paribus, the CPI goes up, 5 years from now, we can expect the real GDP to still be at 20 trillion after the short-run dust kind of settles, all right? So here's how this looks. The long-run aggregate supply curve looks like this. All right, long-run aggregate supply. I'll call this LRAS from now on. Get a new marker here. This is a graph showing the relationship between CPI and real GDP produced in the long run. This is a strange concept because what it's basically doing is it answers the question, if CPI changes, now, what happens years down the road? Okay, if CPI changes now, what happens years down the road? What happens after the short run? Short run may take a while, okay? Maybe it takes a while for wages to unstick. Maybe it takes a while for the misperceptions theories to go away. But what this is basically saying is after those effects go away, what happens to production, okay? And here's how it looks. Here's real GDP. Here's CPI. And here is the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, that's LRAS. My handwriting's really falling apart here. I need to do better. The long run aggregate supply. And the logic here is if the CPI goes up, maybe that causes some short run effects, but that's not in this graph that we're drawing here. Okay? In the long run, eventually what's going to happen is the real GDP isn't going to change. So if the CPI goes up by 10%, nominal GDP will also go up by 10%, leading to no change in the eventual real GDP. So the real GDP stays the same here at that level. Okay? So what this shows us is when the CPI changes, there are no long-run effects on production. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. It's vertical because changes in the CPI have no effect on the real GDP produced in the long run. And that gets us mostly through Chapter 8, and I'm going to kind of stop here a little short. There's really, usually when I teach this in class, I go through a little bit more in Chapter 8, but for Chapter 9, I broke it up into 2 classes, so we've got a little extra time available in the next couple of classes, so I'm going to take a bit from this chapter and insert it tomorrow into the next lecture, just to try to make sure that every day has about the same amount of content. So I'm going to stop here with what I would call Chapter 8, and then we'll go into Chapter 9 tomorrow and cover some of these things in greater detail then. Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 look at a lot of the same concepts, so the line is kind of hard to tell between Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. It all bleeds together in my mind. So I'll stop here. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to take aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply and put it all together, okay, in the next chapter. Please, I know I've said this a few times in these videos, please, please, please read the book. Please find other content here because this is really hard to cover, especially in an online class, because I can't interact with you guys, and there's also no good way for you to really practice it, right? When you're solving for CPI, I could give you numbers, tell you to do the practice worksheets. You could work through it and see if you understand it. You really can't do that with this. The only way to practice this is just to understand it, to keep reading, to write, to think about things. So you need to be doing that on your own. That's the end of Chapter 8. Things are getting tough in this class.